Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday keynote session. It's my great pleasure to have Matt Watson, founder, president, Precious Metals Commodity Management, LLC. Matt, this isn't his first time doing presentations for Red Cloud. We really appreciate your time back. Matt's an operations executive with over 30 years experience in engineering, statistical consulting, and supply chain management. Brings very, very unique and deep insights into the end market for many of the commodities that that many of our issuers and investors care about. So without further ado, I want to give Matt the most amount of time here. Matt, please take it away. I know he's going to speak on copper, silver, and he's able to field questions on just about everything lit up on that periodic table you see in front of you today. So they don't need to be focused on copper and silver, although that will be the main focus of the presentation today. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thanks for having me back. Again, the name is Matt Watson, Precious Metals Commodity Management. So yeah, you can see the number of metals on the periodical table that I deal with in the course of my business. Pretty significant group of metals. Copper and silver are fascinating. So let's get into that. Real quickly, a little bit about me. Based in California, out here in beautiful Northern California, just outside the Silicon Valley. Have a broad range of clients. Been doing more and more in the mining space, as you may come to appreciate as I go through the presentation a little bit more. I deal with the industrial base quite a bit. I help with thrifting and trading support and risk management in general. Involved with a number of metals. I do subscription reports that a number of people have keyed in on. The one that's garnered a lot of attention in the past year, as about a year or two, I think, ahead of most analysts, on basically screaming about the mineral constraints that we're stepping into with clean energy and the electrification of everything. So this clean energy report has garnered a lot of attention. I've been doing lots of pitches over the past year. Kitco interviews, Red Cloud, other forums, the International Precious Metals Institute, and really my ongoing mantra is this will be the century of clean energy and mineral constraints, unlike we've ever observed in human history. There's really two primary macro drivers that are making this all happen. One has to do with clean energy. And I'm trying to get this to hide here up top. I don't know why it's not. In any event, IRENA, they advertise, of course, all the time, the International Renewable Energy Agency, that the levelized cost of renewable energy is getting cheaper as you look at it over time. Solar is getting cheaper, wind is getting cheaper. And each year or every couple of years, they'll put out a roadmap through the next 20 to 30 years. And essentially, the roadmap they came out with this year in March of 2021 is the biggest roadmap they've ever projected to leverage off these presumably lower cost renewable sources. And to give you some context, this slide from one of IRENA slide decks, I think, tells the story the best. In 2018, the global power grid was made up of 14% renewables. And 86% largely fossil fuels. And the roadmap that they were promoting as short as 3 years ago, in 2018, they were talking about the need to grow that renewable mix to 23% by the year 2050. Well, so much for the roadmap from 3 years ago. They have dramatically altered that here 3 years later. So here comes their 2021 roadmap. Suddenly now they're promoting, oh, we need to have a whopping 74% renewables by 2050. And just to give you the math, to get from point A here in 2018 to 2050, that means 90% of all new installations of energy should be renewables to get to this level of penetration. And so that's astonishing. And this has huge implications for copper and silver. There's just no doubt about it. Along for the ride, they want to have 8.1 terawatts or 8,100 gigawatts of onshore and offshore wind. They want to have 14,000 gigawatts of solar PV installed and operational by 2050. Just to give you a pictorial, so this IRENA has put out these roadmaps every couple of years, and I just show you a sequence of these roadmaps. On the left is solar. Here's what they showed over over nearly 2 decades of progressions on these roadmaps, and steeper and steeper ramps in solar and steeper ramps in wind. Forget these older roadmaps. Let's go look at the latest roadmaps. These only go through 2035. The latest roadmaps go through all the way through 2050. I had to change the scale. Those previous years are all crunched down here in the bottom of these graphs. So for solar, you can see how big of a jump now they're promoting that we do for 2021. And the actual, we've been overachieving, quite frankly, to the roadmaps that they've shown. It's not like we're lagging. We're actually overachieving in most cases. For wind, they want to see the same thing. They want to see another explosion in growth in the wind installations. So forget all those previous roadmaps. We're going to go big. And I can't emphasize this enough. This is a large amount of metals that are going to be involved in this transition. The other big macro trend that's going on is just the general electrification of everything in our everyday lives. Not only those renewable sources, you hear a lot about the hydrogen economy, electric vehicles as a part of this. 5G is consuming a lot of different metals in different ways. You'll hear over the next decade, there's going to be more of a transition to talking about buildings and homes and things that we can do to lower our power consumption. For industrial buildings, there's coatings and things that you can do to the glass that are going to help with power consumption. Heavy industries, all the big polluting industries like ammonia, cement, a number of chemical industries, they want to green these up dramatically, and there's efforts underway there to trial next generation processes to green these up. Smart cities, where you have MEMS sensors on all your waters and utilities and traffic and everything you can measure about the performance of a city, all tied into an AI network with intelligence that improves the performance of your city. And of course, just electronics in general, including the Internet of Things. I love to tell people, just consider the number of connected devices. 1.7 billion in 2018 is going to grow to a whopping 4 billion connected devices by 2024. And that slope continues. Everything is getting more and more interconnected. And so this is all fine and dandy, but as a supply chain guy, I keep preaching around the globe, there's a huge disconnect to the mining industry. The two aren't talking to one another. Nobody's doing the fundamental supply chain analysis. What does all this take? And it takes metals. I love sending the simple message, electrons just don't pass through the air, they pass through minerals. If you're going to electrify everything, you need minerals to do this. And there's a big disconnect here on this front. Furthering, this acceleration in electronics is the vehicles that we drive. I've shown this slide before. I think this is effective at getting across the point. Today, an ICE, an internal combustion engine vehicle, a gas or diesel engine, anywhere from 35 to 40% of the vehicle cost is electronics. When you get into hybrids and plug-in hybrids like the Toyota Prius, there you're talking 50 to 55% of the vehicle cost is electronics. You get into a full range BEV a la Tesla, now you're at 70%. You're talking a Toyota Mirai or a Hyundai Nexo fuel cell electric vehicle, you're closer to 80%. Unclear what the autonomous vehicles, these self-driving vehicles are going to be, but the loading should be fairly high there as well. And just to give you some sense in contrasting an ICE versus a BEV, the copper loadings are 3 times higher and the silver loadings are 2 times higher when you jump from ICE to BEVs. And year over year, even within ICE, this number is creeping up. We're putting more electronics, more infotainment, more driver assist, more safety systems. There's computers for engine management. There's another computer for emissions control and so forth. So just a huge amount of electronics on our vehicles. And it's to the point that even these agencies like IRENA, and now I'm talking about the International Energy Agency, is touting, hey, we've got to beware, guys. There's a list of what they've defined as critical minerals. Here is their list right here, starting with copper, lithium, nickel, and so forth. And they talk very plainly that a conventional car or an ICE vehicle versus a BEV, you need 3 times the copper. You're going to need that lithium. You're going to need that nickel. You're going to need manganese. You're going to need cobalt. You're going to need graphite. But wait, renewables as well. Solar PV uses 3 times the copper versus this for the same megawatts as compared to the conventional power grid, and a lot of silicon. That's what the wafers are made of, is the silicon. Onshore wind, 3x the copper and a lot of zinc. They coat the wind blades with zinc. That helps give them a lot of weathering capabilities to survive big storms and huge wind blasts. Look at the copper loadings in offshore wind. It goes even higher still. And so I think this is a pretty good list of critical minerals. I think there's a few mistakes that they've made, or exceptions that they didn't put in here. One is silver. I think silver should be on this list. And by the time you go through this presentation with me today, I think you'll agree. And then with an eye toward the hydrogen economy, there's 3 PGMs that are going to stand out in the hydrogen economy. Platinum, a minor metal called iridium, and another minor metal called ruthenium. Platinum, iridium, and ruthenium. I think those 4 should have made the list. And in fact, I'm communicating with these people, sending my data and my analysis to explain as to why that's the case. I think that their next revision of this report, I think they would consider adding more minerals to this list. These loadings are fairly accurate, so you can look at it, kilograms per vehicle or kilograms per megawatt of power generation. You can do your own modeling. And of course, you guys in the mining space, I'm preaching to the choir here, but of course, there's all sorts of new regulatory hurdles and ESG compliance issues that you have to jump through to get a mine from funding all the way to operations. The timelines have grown substantially, as you guys know. An open pit copper mine of yesteryear that might have taken 5 years, it's more like 7, even 10 years. PGM mining, the platinum group metal minings, those are much deeper shafts, half mile to a mile deep. What used to be 10 to 15 years is probably more like a 15 to 20 years now for a new greenfield project in PGMs. And so we're doing things to make these hurdles more complex. And of course, this whole, in the background, you guys know this better than I do, there's this NIMBY mentality. Nobody wants to see this in their backyard. I think the Biden administration's view toward mining of rare earths and some critical metals in the US, they just don't want to do it. As an analyst, by the way, this is why I think analysts need to be showing 20 and 30-year views on some of these metals. And there's huge risks in forecasting that far out. I'll be the first one to tell you that. But you need to have some downstream look, given the timelines involved in mining, just so people can anticipate and respond. In all my presentations, and I have variations of this, again, this is going to focus on copper and silver, I go through a set of a low and a high demand case these days. I'll show you my base case or low case of a powertrain mix for vehicles, and I'll show you a zero emission mandate case. This is what all these countries claiming they're going to force BEVs, what that case looks like. I'm going to do a solar PV, half of what I just showed you for that 2021 roadmap, versus all of what they want. Same thing for wind, both onshore and offshore, half and all. Fuel cell vehicles, this is not a PGM presentation, but this is about as far as you can go with the available platinum metals that we have available today and the high loadings of PGMs in fuel cell vehicles versus double that amount. If you get involved with the Hydrogen Council, they have a view on how much green electrolysis we need, half of what they want versus all of that. And then ammonia, people don't think of ammonia as being a hydrogen. It is a form of hydrogen. It's effectively 45% more dense than liquid hydrogen. 2x today's ammonia market versus growing at 6x. Lots of discussion about uses of that for marine fuel. So I use these as kind of my low and high case in a consistent set of modeling. And I want to impress upon everybody, so you hear all these things about zero emission vehicle bans. Will Ferrell's favorite country, Norway, and their whopping 170,000 cars a year that they sell, new cars. They've made a declaration that by 2025, they're going to be 100% electric. And part of the zero emission ban, by the way, is to ban hybrids and to ban plug-in hybrid vehicles, which to me is a fascinating discussion on its own. Europe, and when you look at their 2020 performance on CO2 emissions and meeting the Paris Climate Accord, it was because of hybrids and plug-in hybrids that they got very close to hitting their metric and hitting their number. Without it, they would have missed terribly. And BEVs, a la Teslas, take much bigger batteries. And I'll show you that a little bit more in the upcoming slides. Meanwhile, a bunch of European countries want to trigger by 2030. Where I'm from, California, we're actually starting with heavy duty and medium duty first. 25% of our mix should be zero emission by 2025 to a 50% mix, and then all vehicles, including light duty, and then on with all these other countries making these declarations. And I tabulate at the bottom here what the effective ICE ban, how many need to be BEVs. So it starts off a pretty slow mix. We're going to easily hit this number. We're already at some 4% globally. Here we need the global number to be to 18%. Here we need the number to be 61% of the global fleet, 72, and so forth. That's a steep ramp curve that I argue we're not going to be able to hit. The IEA is even concerned about us hitting this based on the multiples in mining expansion that need to occur for lithium, cobalt, and nickel in particular. This next slide is a pictorial of that base case versus a zero emission case. My base case, here's our COVID doldrums that we're in as we come out. Vehicle sales growing, I think, potentially to over 140 million a year by 2050. On the high case, it's the same number of vehicles. The only difference between the two charts is the mix. Gasoline in the blue, diesel in the gray, hybrids and plug-in hybrids. And I'm going to start referring to these as small lithium battery vehicles here. The full range 300-mile plus BEVs, a la Teslas, are in this category in green. And it's probably a poor color choice, but in white, this little top cap here. Fuel cell electric vehicles. It's a different presentation, but we're going to be capped by the amount of platinum available. The penetration rates in fuel cell vehicles are going to be very limited based on the available platinum. And so I think this is a realistic mix. You'll notice I have a line here in red on the right-hand axis. This is an expression of the total battery demand. And so, for example, a Tesla, an average Tesla day is like an 82 or 85 kilowatt battery. If you add up all the 300-mile BEVs times 85, and these batteries here tend to be smaller, anywhere from 5 to 15 kilowatts in size in the yellow. You add them all up, you go from kilowatts to megawatts to gigawatts to terawatts when you go into millions of these units. And this is an expression of a little under 6 terawatts of battery demand by 2050 in my base case. Versus the zero emission case, here it's a very jagged step, you'll notice. That jagged step corresponds to these steps on the previous listing of countries and their declarations of zero emission mandates. I think the reality would be smoothed out if we were capable to hit this, but I left it jagged just to make it easier to kind of correlate with the other. And this is, again, just light duty, but here we need a light duty total vehicle demand. It's about 12.6 terawatts of battery demand by 2050. And again, I just don't think we could hit these numbers. It's too many minerals. It's too much lithium. It's too much nickel. It's too much cobalt. And I put it in the context of a CAGR chart. And I want you to focus on this line here is terawatts of demand for light duty only. And that is the same as this dashed line. This is the light duty vehicle demand line here. When you add heavy duty as well, heavy duty and medium duty on top of that, it adds on roughly another 2 terawatts of battery demand by 2050. And when you think about the CAGR going from 2020 to 2050, my base case scenario is an 11% CAGR growth. From a mining industry perspective, I could bore you to death with the detail, but the PGM mining ramp in South Africa achieved approximately 11% CAGR as it was ramped and built basically to meet emission standards in all the PGMs that went into catalytic converters. So we've done this before. Hitting a 15 or 16% CAGR over a 3-decade span, that's a very fast CAGR. And from a mining perspective, with all those ESG and regulatory hurdles you have, that's going to be extremely difficult to achieve. And I show what that CAGR, of 15% to get to the end point by 2050. To hit these different steps at the 2040 zero emission mandates of 35 or 30, you need a faster CAGR over a shorter sprint. You got to go faster sooner to hit those points. I argue we're going to miss these zero emission mandates, that we're not going to be able to hit these countries' goals just simply out of the mining multiples. And this is just the easiest way I've come up with. And this is coming from kind of a sick statistician's mind of how to view this, but that's how I view the world on this. So let's talk about copper and silver. What's so hot about copper and silver on that periodical table? Simple. They're the most conductive metals on that periodical table. Silver is the most conductive metal in the world. When you express conductivity of copper versus itself, 100%. So copper is 100%. Gold is 70% of the conductivity of copper. Well, gold's pretty expensive and not that abundant. How about aluminum? Ooh, 61% of the conductivity of copper. And then from there, it drops off big time. You get down to these very low numbers. And from an electricity transmission perspective, just to give you a story very quickly, all of our overhead power lines around the globe are actually made up of aluminum cabling. They wish the conductivity was higher. They wish it was closer to 90 or 95 or 100% of copper. It's not. Aluminum is far more abundant. It's lighter weight. It's actually easier to suspend in these overhead lines with fewer towers and the towers farther apart, so less infrastructure cost. But if you don't know, you should know there's transmission losses over the large states and over parts of the country where you generate electricity at a power plant. By the time you get to the point of distribution, you've lost X% of that power. Well, conductivity plays a key role in those losses. It ends up whenever they do underground or underwater cabling, almost inevitably, those are made of copper with higher conductivity. And even though there's an insulator around the copper wiring underwater or underground, the water and the soil provides a dissipation path for the electricity to escape from transmission and into the ground or into the water. So inevitably, you got to use copper. And so now when you think about offshore windmills, you're generating the power offshore, you got to get that through a copper cable that's dropped on the seabed floor to connect to the grid on land. Or when you're building a solar farm, you need to use copper that will route it through the inverter, and from the inverter to connect it to the power grid. And it's all a function, the size of the copper cabling that you need is all a function of how much energy are you transmitting. The diameters and mass, if you will, are dictated by the amount of electrons that you're trying to transport. Silver, more of a scarce metal, extremely high conductivity. It's got great flexibility and curing capabilities. People have been using this on solar panels for decades. There's a reason for it. There's a reason engineers specify this. So really, these are your top choices. There's even some government efforts to try to improve the conductivity of aluminum to make it more copper-esque. In decades of study, the highest they've got this to is 64% of the conductivity of copper. And that's through the addition of some rare earth elements, which by their nature are rare and won't get us very far commercially. So this is a real engineering dilemma that the world would love to conquer, but they just haven't been able to date. And there's slides, for the sake of time, I pushed into the backup that go through the detail on EV loadings and on solar and wind and show you those copper demands over time. I've summarized all the copper demand on all its different applications on these charts. On the left, I show the base case, which is the base case powertrain mix with half of those renewables that IRENA wants. On the right-hand side, I show what if it's a zero emission mandate case with all the renewables that IRENA wants. And you start adding all this up. Here we are. This is the price per metric ton for copper. As you may know, once again, we're passing through $10,000 a ton. I think it was over 10,005 this morning. Yeah, we're short. Most analysts will claim we're about 1 million to 1.5 million tons a year short. So and there's a projected roll off. So there's a concern about us gapping out significantly on copper. And when you talk about the EVs, the transportation, when you talk about the wind and the solar, and I didn't get into it, but to charge these EVs, we're going to have to grow the global power grid some 50% larger than today's global power grid, just to do the charging of what will be 2 to 2.5 billion EVs on the road by 2050. When you add up all those sources, whether it be in my low case or the high case, and just to toggle back, I mean, not that the copper demand was going to grow anyway, just as we electrify everything, but renewables in these EVs are just like hitting the gas. You're really hitting the accelerator. And I'm really just stunned at how much metal we need. And so if you add up 2021 through 2050, what's the sum of all these demands in my base case? Well, it's almost 1 billion tons of copper. That's after you do take away and account for your recycle. Well, hold it. Our global reserves are only 870 million tons. So that's 100% of your known global reserves and 9% of the bucket beyond that that is labeled inferred resources. We know where it's at, but it's at such a lower ore grade or a depth or a cost to extract that's not feasible today. It would take higher prices to even make it warranted to extract it. But you could see where this is headed. And even my high case really isn't that different. It's still 100% of the global reserves and 20% of the inferred resources. That's a lot of copper. I love telling this story. 560 million tons of copper mined in the past 1,000 years. Forget about it. That was nothing. We need twice that amount in the next 30. Just a huge amount of copper is going to be needed. Well, what's going on with our exploration? Well, here's the USGS data on copper plotted over time. So if you went back to 1950, this is what the global reserves were. And they grew as they found more deposits and there was some consumption, consumed it down, more exploration, more discoveries. And now we're sitting here at just under 900 million tons or 870 tons of known reserves, according to the 2021 USGS report. The shocking part of this is when you look at the new deposits that were discovered in this time frame here, there's 226 new deposits. And then suddenly in the past 3 years, yikes, only 3 new deposits. Now this data is about a year old. There could be a couple new ones that have popped onto the list. Might be a little bit down rev over the past year, but the rate of new exploration has slowed dramatically. Where is this going to come from? It's a challenge. And then in terms of years equivalent, the demands at these different points in time, this represents about 35 years worth of known resources in our global reserves today. So, and we're accelerating the rate of consumption. So we gotta do something. Let's jump to silver. Here, I'm going to show you the copper demand for solar PV in my base case versus the high case. 50% of what Arena wants versus 100% of what they want. Last year, 2020, we installed 115 gigawatts of new solar installations globally. It consumed a little under 100 million troy ounces of silver. That's 1/10. That's 10% of the global silver market, both mined plus recycled. Here's the same data, but on a faster growth rate, doing exactly what Arena wants. Here we're going to grow to like 23% of the silver market by 2050. Here we're going to grow to 50% of the silver market going into solar PV alone. Wow, that's a lot of silver. Some 8.2 billion troy ounces versus 5.4 billion troy ounces between here and 2050. And we've only got 16 billion in total known reserves globally. Well, that's just solar PV. Let's add in vehicle demands. Remember, your EV loadings on silver about twice as high because there's twice the electronics in a full range BEV, and so it makes sense you're gonna have twice the silver. And I do some calculations on how much is going into the different categories of vehicles, and you can see that this richer dose of BEVs is going to drive more silver demand. And when you add up all the different sources of silver demand, and I make some really crude assumptions. Yeah, there's some net physical investments in this gray, and there's jewelry in this light blue, and even silverware. So those are a bit elective. The rest is all hard industrial demand. Silver is going to become much more of an industrial-based metal over time. I preach this to the Silver Institute all the time. I make some people nervous when, silver has been an investment product a la gold for decades. But there's a point where we're going to start using the majority of this for industrial applications and electronics. I think there'll be a shift in time. And back to our, associating this with the global reserves, my base case, when you add it all up, we're going to chew through all the global reserves and 54% of the inferred resources. You need to double the silver mining. We also need to do a much better job of recycle and recovery, by the way, as well. That's a message I'm preaching to recycle environments. There's too much that's going into landfills in the form of the low-grade silver from e-waste and even solar panels themselves, that we need to recycle these. We can't keep throwing this into our landfills. Got to recover it. So that's another message that I'm preaching, just so you know. The zero emission case, it gets even worse. Same picture on silver reserves. If you go to USGS and you plot the historical, we hit a peak in 1990. That's when we had over 18 billion troy ounces of reserves. We've consumed that down. We're down to about 16 billion today. And the years equivalent of supply, we're sitting at about 20 years in known reserves. Then you get into a discussion, well, how much investment product are above ground? Well, we got about 1.2 billion troy ounces in ETFs, another 3 billion troy ounces in Zurich and London vaults, probably 4 years of physical above ground. And then you get into a discussion, well, how much inferred resources? The USGS doesn't even have any statement on inferred resources for silver. There's some papers that try to estimate how much is in the Earth's crust that I lean on. You know, maybe there's a total of another 30 years beyond this and other materials at very low grades. This is going to be a problem, especially when you consider the top 10 global silver mines are now approaching 30 years of age. Hey now, what are we going to do about silver? So copper, it's been on a, it's been a noisy ride. It's very much a supply demand driven function. And again, it's passing through 10.5 right now. So this is a little bit outdated. The price is right here. But I think it's pretty natural to assume that you're going to overachieve to that 5% historical CAGR in this supply demand state. Silver, the same thing. Silver, if you plot it out, it's been a bit noisy, but on average, it's been an 8.3% CAGR since the year 2000. And there's no reason to believe that that trend won't continue as well. So more mining is needed, guys. So this is obviously in your wheelhouse. And frankly, we're already too late given some of these timelines. I do summary tables on these and other metals where I show my base case versus the zero emission case. Here's the total demand. Here's how much recycle I see happening. Here's the net mining demand versus global reserves. Yet in this case, you need 100% of your copper and 9% of these inferred resources, just so you see the numbers where they came from. So nice little summary table. And then, of course, for executives, you got to plot it out. So I focused on copper and silver in this paper. And if you go back and look at the tape from my previous Red Cloud presentation, I did focus on the battery metals, the nickel, cobalt, and lithium. I put that on here as well. So lithium, the global reserves, we're in a much better position. The cobalt and nickel are going to be challenged. You're going to need all the global reserves and dig into inferred resources for my base case. For the zero emission case, you're going to blow through the global reserves in that zero emission case. Also on this chart, you'll notice I've got platinum, ruthenium, and iridium. Matt's hot on the hydrogen economy. I'd give some context to those PGMs. Well, it ends up on the PGMs. We know where there's over 200 years worth of known reserves. It's sitting right there in South Africa. That's the good news. The bad news is, again, it's a half mile to a mile deep. Some of the most expensive and complex mining on the planet. And there's not a lot of investors lining up to do new greenfield projects there. If you look into the PGM mining space, a lot of brownfield project expansions, existing mines that are starting to approach end of life, and they may drill a shaft right neighboring next door and expand into the neighboring plot, and use the same above ground smelters and concentrators and above ground assets just to extend the life of their mining operations. So there's brownfield projects, not a lot of greenfield, but here we know where it's at. And I could show you the data here. We do need to double the PGM mining. If you want to, buy into some of my subscription reports, I'll walk you through why I think the hydrogen economy is so important. And the answer is simply these renewables that we're putting onto ourselves, wind and solar, they're variable renewables. They're not reliable energy sources. We're leveling the power grid from a time of day perspective and seasonal perspective is going to become a very hot topic in the future if we continue to deploy these variable renewables the way we are. And either sources like nuclear that are very stable around the clock, but nuclear is not favored in a lot of nations, including the US. Either you have that to help you level the grid, or you're going to have to get into topics with hydrogen and ammonia to be an energy storage mechanism to help you level the grid. And so I think these are by default, are going to become important down the road. So I covered a lot of information. Copper and silver we're going to electrify everything eventually anyway. This one's, there's almost no avoiding. The battery space, I think we're going to choke as we continue to expand. Again, we're at some 4% penetration on BEVs, and they want to jump us to 76% penetration. Yes, that's multiples in mining, and the lithium and the cobalt and the nickel mines, just they're not staged for that level of expansion. We're going to choke on that expansion. We're going to absolutely need these, and this is an opportunity for investment that is, I think, yet to really show itself. And so with that, I'm done. Bruce, how do you do on time?
Yeah, you're very good on time, Tim. I think narrowing in your focus to a couple of commodities certainly brought you in. I mean, we really appreciate the depth of your end market analysis.
Yeah.
I would just mention to everybody watching in live, please, now is the moment if you want to add some questions to the queue. I'm happy to pose them to Matt. I'm going to just begin by saying, Matt, that Red Cloud and at Red Cloud, we spent a bunch of time talking to our mining companies about these types of needs. But I'm wondering, with you and your consulting background, talking to a lot of end market customers, is the message starting to get out there to those people that of the metal constraints and the requirements going forward? Like, I've seen comments from Elon Musk about requirements in nickel and him making specific requests, but I'm just wondering if it's getting a little broader at this point.
Well, in Elon's case, I mean, I talked about this before. You're going to see some of these auto OEMs have to invest in the mining directly themselves, and we've seen that with Tesla. We heard starting in his quarter two 2020 financial results that he was looking for responsibly sourced nickel, and so he's solving that problems by buying his way into to New Caledonia, into the Goro mine, and then there's this latest mine he just bought his way into. And so he's putting his money where his mouth is, and he's going to develop what he considers to be a responsible mining process. There's lots of ESG concerns around nickel in particular, especially in Indonesia and that region and the Coral Triangle, whether it be mine tailing dumpings into the ocean, whether it be, there's some new smelting steps that they're adding for nickel pig iron to get rid of the iron to make battery grade nickel. He refuses to do that. He wants the lowest possible CO2 footprint with responsible mine tailing management. So credit to Elon for that. And I think you'll see other companies be forced into that path as well, on the lithium battery front in particular. But no, I don't think it has caught on in the PGM space. Platinum group metals miners are not exactly lining up to do massive expansions on PGMs. I think they should be. So I'm trying to win over more and more of these analysts with these longer views. Like I said, I'm working with some investment bankers as well now, who I think have the right vision, trying to win them over to this view. I think with most investors, they want to see the prices climb. Show me 50% increase to 100% increase, then they'll commit, right? They want to see the needle move on the pricing, and then they'll jump in.
Tim, one of the questions that's come in on the line is do you look at the tin market at all? Is that one of the commodities you look at all?
I have, one of the problems with tin is the Congo. It's a conflict mineral. So from an electronics consumption perspective, yes, I have. Again, keep in mind, there's these conflict minerals, tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold from the Congo that are problematic. And those are markets where you almost have bimodal pricing in place because of these conflict sources that are finding their way into our ecosystem, and how you manage that and control for that is there's a lot of electronics firms that are very concerned about that.
Okay. Another question we've got is let's talk about and rank, if you will, the commodities you're most bullish on, both short, medium, and long term, if you were to rank them based on restraints.
So I called palladium and personally invested in palladium at about 400 to 600, did quite well. I saw the rhodium coming and couldn't. Rhodium's a much more difficult one to invest in as a minor metal. I'm hot today on iridium and ruthenium both. There's so many electronics applications and chloralkali applications and use in electrolyzers. I think those two very minor metals bode extremely well. Silver, I tell people don't expect $200 silver overnight, but by 2045, I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't expect $200 silver. I think it's going to be that tight of a market. So I'm, if you're willing to play a longer view, silver, certainly I'm very optimistic and bullish about. Copper, obviously, as I just described. Aluminum is another one. There's a number of rare earth and specialty metals that I'm hot on, including scandium, SC on the periodical table, the rare earths themselves. There's virtually no recycle on rare earths today, and that really is going to put immense pressure on the rare earth mining basket. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. This may not be your area of expertise. I know you're much more of an end market demand sort of analyst, but someone asking, will the seabed resources be able to meet some of the demand?
Oh boy, really good question. So there's all this resistance, people think about mining the seabed floor. I think in time it's unavoidable. I think it has to happen. I'm more worried about studying the effects of tailing dumpings into the ocean. I think some of these extraction processes that they're talking about are less disturbing in nature, the way they want to go about doing it. A lot of these nodules they want to harvest are very, right on top of the surface, or very shallow. So it's not like you'd be disrupting the seabed floor dramatically. In both cases, of course, I think there needs to be, ecological study to make sure there's no impacts. But I'm much more worried about the mine tailing dumping into the oceans than I am extraction. And I think to your question, the person asking the question, it's almost inevitable we're going to have to go there.
Yeah, I watched a very interesting report recently out of Goldman Sachs where they suggested that the commodities being the old world, if you will, and the fact that most new investment today is either focused on, the actual electric vehicle makers or the battery makers,
right,
or the end product guys, we're running into an old world problem where the lack of investment in either the supply itself or the infrastructure to supply, both in these metals for the decarbon future, or even the old carbon like oil and gas supply constraints as well. It really seems like we're heading into a world where we're going to need significantly higher prices to wake people up.
Absolutely. And the other aspect of this, in the battery side, you go to battery conferences for the past 5 years, it's very much been an engineering driven discussion. They want these high nickel composition, low cobalt designs for higher energy density, more power per kilogram. And yet, as everybody's built these battery factories and built all this nameplate capacity, to your point, I think the supply chain management and the executives are finally winning out the day. And they're saying, what in the hell are we doing? We don't have this underpin. And there's a lot of chemistry decisions. And if you remember one of my previous presentations, this thing called an LFP, a lithium iron phosphate, where you use a lot of cheap iron ore and phosphates, low cost materials, using an older generation chemistry. It's lower energy density by about 20 to 30% lower energy density, meaning you need more kilograms to do the same thing. But here's Tesla, VW, and some of the big boys changing big parts of their supply chain, saying, no, we're going to do LFP-based designs, not these nickel-rich designs. And that's probably been one of the most underreported things going on in the battery space. And it's all out of this analysis that, like what I'm talking about, it's just not going to come quick enough. Yeah, they want the nickel-rich stuff, but it's going to be a problem. And so there's all sorts of discussions you get into there on the chemistry front, but that's another thing to watch. They're going to find as many workarounds as they can. The bottom line is you still need the lithium. That's why you're seeing some of these focus on the lithium market in particular, even with these chemistry alterations and even next generation battery designs like lithium sulfur, you still need the lithium. So the lithium's the one constant in all those chemistry designs, for what it's worth.
Well, listen, Matt.
For what it's worth.
Well, listen, Matt, we really appreciate it. There is a couple more questions. We may after this connect you with with some of those people who might have
Please.
direct questions for you. I note to everybody on this call that we have Matt Watson's connections, both his phone number and his email on this, and his website. I'm sure Matt would be happy to reach out individually to those that have further questions. But thank you very much for once again hosting this discussion.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Bruce.
Thank you so much, Matt, and have a great day, everyone.